Great, thanks for having me, everybody. So I am gonna just jump right in because we have a few slides to go through. So I'm gonna go here and hide that. Okay, great. So my title of my talk is EP Social Media, Is the Juice Worth the Squeeze? So it's always sort of, I think, an important topic to talk about because social media is so prevalent these days. So I always talk about how I got started in this medium. So I joined about a decade ago, a little bit scary to think about. And I really spent about 2 years just sort of watching and sort of lurking on the website a little bit, just sort of trying to figure out what it was all about and whether or not I was brave enough to actually send out my first tweet ever. And so really one of my first tweets ever was sent out at HRS 2012. And I thought, you know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to be sort of a science communicator. And so I thought it was pretty safe to do that, just to sort of, you know, send out facts and not have to sort of be controversial in any sort of way. And so I sort of just did that just during HRS. And then, you know, I kind of dropped it in between meetings and I'd pick it up again at HRS. And then I finally went to like my first tweet up in 2014 at HRS and, you know, met some people that you probably know these days, one of whom is John Mandrola. And, you know, I really talked to these guys and said, you know, I don't really know about this medium. I'm a little nervous about it. But they said, you know, you have a voice and it's a great way to sort of use your voice on this platform. So they really encouraged me to sort of do it. But, you know, I still was not really sure about the whole thing because I thought, you know, is this just like some horrible time sink that I'm just going to doom scroll all day? And is it just going to sort of waste my time? And is it just sort of like fluff, right? That I'm just going to be watching like these cute dog videos or whatever. But what I ended up learning, you know, I'll share with you over the past decade what I have learned. And there's, you know, I sort of look at it the way that one of my old attendings would ask me this question: is the juice worth the squeeze, right? So is it really worth are the good parts worth the risk of the bad parts? So we'll go through a little bit of this today. So here's my first slide of that, talking about, you know, we'll go through the benefits of EP social media. So we'll take sort of a bird's eye view, and then we'll sort of drill down a little bit to sort of an everyday applicability view, and then we'll sort of like rise back up again to look at sort of future viewpoints first. Okay, so in order to sort of look at that, you never can sort of think about social media in EP without thinking of using it at conferences, right? Because that's probably the most prevalent way that we had used it at the very beginning. And so the people who really used it at the beginning in conferences were actually the family medicine people. And so they had their, you know, teaching family medicine conference in 2013, and it was a 5-day conference. So that is really long. We never have 5-day conferences anymore. And there were only 181 users, and there were only about 2,000 tweets, which seems really a tiny number now. But what was interesting that they found was when they looked at it, about 70% of those tweets were really session related, and there really were not that many social tweets. So when they really went down and analyzed it and talked to the people who were doing the tweeting to say, hey, why did you even want to do this in the first place? There are 3 main themes that it sort of centered around, and that was networking, information sharing, and advocacy. And what the users said was that they said tweeting made the sessions more interactive, it facilitated networking, it made them actually want to come in person more. So the next year, so you would think, you know, using all this virtual stuff would make people not want to come in person, but it actually drove them to want to come meet more people. And then it also, they felt that they were able to sort of share ideas and learn from people, even for those people that weren't attending live. The other thing that they thought is that, you know, it was a nice way to sort of come closer to a new generation that was maybe using these more mobile devices more regularly. So then we did it ourselves. We did our own study looking at this a couple years ago, and we looked at ACC, HRS, and TCT over 3 years, just looking at the Twitter use during those conferences. And we actually came out with 80,000 tweets that we analyzed. And so what we found was that it grew, almost doubled every single year, year over year, the number of users, the number of tweets, and the number of impressions as well. And what was interesting, if you see in this sort of, let me see if I can turn on my highlighter. If you see in this sort of top corner here, that conference attendees in person didn't really drop. So again, this sort of fear that using social media or using virtual ways would cause a decrease in in-person meetings really was unfounded. We found that it also held true across all 3 conferences. So you can see here ACC, HRS, and TCT all sort of doubled or tripled throughout the years as far as use went. And what was interesting again is that we confirmed that the majority of the tweets that were sent out were really scientific or educational in some way. And that really physicians were driving the conversation. So that was really interesting on in this study that we did. So who else is sort of in this space? So not just sort of conferencing people, but medical journals have been in the space for a little while as well. So this is a paper from 2016 from the Brigham. And what they found was, they wrote this editorial to sort of talk about the fact that they saw that many of the top medical journals started to enter the social media space a little bit because they thought that it would be important to sort of provide reach that went beyond just their print subscription. And they thought it might be a nice way to sort of rapidly disseminate new findings that might change clinical practice. And so they really found that that did happen in 2015 when they looked at the numbers on their social media use in regards to the 2015 CPR guidelines. They had 1.5 million views on Facebook and more than 100,000 click-throughs within a week of the publication just on social media itself. And so if you really look at the medical journals today, if you look at the big medical journals, if I go back to that one slide and you look in this box here, you can see that Circ at that time in 2016 had about 10,000 followers or so. Today, when you look at Circulation and New England and all the big journals, they have hundreds of thousands of followers virtually for all of these major medical journals. And, it really ties in well with what that paper in 2016 sort of said, which is they felt that if journals really and clinicians really started to use social media a little bit more, maybe it would be a nice way for healthcare providers to communicate with their patients to try to improve health and wellness. So as we know, with the medical journals that are on there, they're not just on there for show, obviously. They actually push out the latest articles and guidelines to their platform pretty immediately, and they embed links, right, as we well know, as well, that you can sort of click through immediately and be brought to the journal article. So it's kind of a nice way to sort of readily access these manuscripts, even in between cases or on the fly, and you can even bookmark them within the app itself, so that you can read these articles at will. So, no longer do we have to have those giant stacks of journals that I know I've had in the corner of my office that you have them sitting there waiting to be read. You can sort of, click through and bookmark and read them as you want. And we know also now that there's lots of Twitter journal clubs, right? So the most famous one, or actually the first ever Twitter journal club, is actually NEPHJC, or the Nephrology Journal Club. That's been around for several years now. And they actually have grown so big that they hold this Twitter journal club in 3 different time zones so that they can actually cater to like a truly global audience. And so they have a huge reach when they discuss their journal articles. And in this one, you can see they had over 161 participants. When was the last time you ever saw anyone come to a journal club with 161 participants, right? And they had over 5 million impressions or 5 million potential views of their content. And so we've done it in EP as well. There was a Jack EP journal club not too long ago. And what's nice is that if you have ever participated in a Twitter journal club, it's almost like, doing a proper journal club, but from the comfort of your own home, right? So you have nice participation of really key opinion leaders. You can get authors in there to participate as well. And pretty much anyone literally who's interested in the manuscript can sort of dive in and converse with any of these key opinion leaders. And again, you have like about an hour to discuss the manuscript as you would in a real life journal club. And then really this reaches, again, a much, much wider audience. So this journal club that we held with Jack EP was with 40 participants, but really about 3 million impressions. So it's pretty impressive there. So what's interesting now, it's evolved so much that Twitter journal clubs are now offering CME, and some of them are even offering MOC. So the people that have done this the best are actually the American Society of Echocardiography. They tend to offer the most CME for participating in their Twitter journal clubs. Excuse me. And this is really quite important now, right? Because during these sort of COVID times, we're not really able to attend in-person conferences at all. And so to be able to obtain CME and MOC in this method is probably pretty good. So we also have Tweetchats that I'm sure many people are aware of. This is another educational platform that's held on Twitter. We schedule them. I know I have done a few with HRS, where we schedule about an hour, maybe once a quarter or a couple times a year, where we choose a topic to discuss, and we, invite, again, key opinion leaders to discuss. For instance, in this one that we did, the Apple Heart Study, we take about an hour. There's questions that are sent out that are pre-prepared. And then again, anyone can participate, including the public. So it's really kind of a nice forum to be able to discuss different topics, including EP topics. And what's interesting is there's this push now to maybe even offer some CME for joining into these tweet chats or even tweetorials. So it'll be interesting to see how that space sort of evolves as well. But I think one of the most valued aspects of having, the ability to participate in social media in electrophysiology is that we really can continue to sort of connect with our colleagues, and it's really not limited by time or space, right? It's almost like having this virtual lounge that you can sort of pop into and out of, that you can discuss cases or chat with each other, and even, continue to network, again, during these COVID times where we cannot, again, go to the national meetings to do so. So what is it about these communities of practice? I'm sure that all of us have seen on social media, if you're on there, the different types of communities of practice that currently exist. There's communities of practice that involve, obviously, not just medical Twitter and ER Twitter and like free online medical education Twitter, but there's also communities of practice for cardiologists, right? So there's cardio Twitter that I'm sure many are aware of. The echo people have their own sort of hashtag. There's the imaging people, the interventional people have their radial first hashtag. Cardio onc has also grown quite a bit, as well as heart failure. They have developed, again, their own hashtags as cardio onc and hashtag GDMT works. And EP, of course, is also in the mix, and we've been in this mix for quite some time as well. The EP hashtag was created several years ago, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Don't Diss the Hish hashtag, as well as the Ablate VT hashtag. And as you can see from these examples, there are a multitude of EP physicians that participate, and it's really international, where we sit and, discuss different topics. We have real-time opinions and polls and offer different standards of care. And then what's really important is that, we also have been able to learn different tips and tricks as well. And in this next slide, you can see one of the examples that was out maybe a couple years ago was the three-way stopcock hemostasis technique. I don't know if anyone's aware that that actually originated from Sam Asnarov when he was in Denver. And he just happened to share this one day on a thread that we were on, talking about how do people obtain hemostasis after their AFib ablations. And it went on, and then he finally posted a video, and we're like, really should publish this. And so he ended up actually doing a series of cases with Sandeep Gautam from Missouri, and they published a series of, I think, about 100 cases in JCE. The other interesting example is, as we know, Don't Diss the Hiss, this is probably one of the first tweets that ever came out in 2015 about Hiss bundle pacing. Hiss bundle pacing is actually old, right? It's been around for a long time, but then there was this sort of resurgence of Hiss bundle pacing after Gopi Dhanamudi and Pugal Vijayaraman sort of put a couple cases on Twitter. And they really credit this Don't Diss the Hiss hashtag and the Twitter platform for really, encouraging this sort of rebirth, if you will, of physiologic pacing. And they ended up actually publishing this really nice editorial, and I think it was Europace, talking about how this use of the hashtag, as well as the number of users and tweets, really paralleled the sales of the Medtronic 3830 or Hiss lead. So it's very interesting to see that happen. But when you think about it, does all of this sort of free education that happens with the Twitter journal clubs and the tweet chats and the tutorials and this sort of tips and tricks, does it really mean anything as far as academic value? And so I think one of my slides is missing, but we'll get back to that in a minute. The other thing that we kind of see also, or we have seen, is we have had some cases where patient safety issues have been actually caught on social media. So this is one really interesting case that happened, I think it was a couple years ago, 3 years ago, 2017, where Gopi Dhanamudi, just posted this really nice tracing of just some noise, right, with some inhibition on a pacemaker tracing, and just wrote thoughts and tagged a bunch of people. And if you look at the time says 5:51 a.m. And so in the next thing, the thread pretty much starts immediately, right? And I don't have all the timestamps on here, but pretty much within 45 minutes, someone from Penn says, you know, it looks like it's abnormal minute ventilation sensing, or the impedance is normal, right? So that's 45 minutes, right? And then it's across the pond here in the next about 6 hours, right? So that's just about 6 hours from the time of the original post. And this person, who is a cardiac physiologist from England, says, hey, look, I know what it is. I saw it recently. We turned off the minute ventilation, and we're doing it in all dependent patients until a fix comes through. So they actually found a problem, and they gave us a fix to it until we could sort of talk to the company. And so what was interesting is, within the month, so Gopi went and sort of called Boston, and there were talks, and within a month there was actually an FDA advisory that came out that talked about this intermittent oversensing of minute ventilation. So I don't know if everyone is super aware of this, but that actually originated on social media. That, you know, Gopi found this, sent it out, and within 6 hours we had an international sort of quorum that said, hey, look, we know what it is, talk to Boston, and then the FDA became involved. And so there was a nice sort of, you know, example of just a patient safety issue that was caught and dealt with pretty immediately. So this was a slide that was a little bit out of order. So does all of this, you know, free education really mean anything academically? Because really that's what matters, right? Is that at some point there has to be some academic currency to this. So it's possible that it may come to some fruition. So in 2016, the Mayo Clinic actually made this announcement that they were going to incorporate digital scholarship into their evaluations for academic promotions and tenure, believe it or not. And why was that? Because they thought that they should really strongly encourage their physicians to sort of participate in public debate, because they did not want to create what they said knowledge obscura that's trapped in ivory towers and only accessible to like the enlightened. But they really wanted their physicians to be able to sort of translate whatever knowledge they gained to the public to sort of influence health outcomes. So they went on to publish several guidance papers thereafter in the past couple of years about not only how we as users of social media could potentially develop social media profiles and packages, but they also talked about how academic institutions maybe a list of sort of best practices for institutions of how to sort of implement this sort of framework to evaluate these portfolios. So what's interesting is that while Mayo really, you know, started this movement, I really am not truly aware of any other institution at this point that has done anything similar. So sort of remains to be seen a little bit about where this sort of goes. So that sort of was the aspect of the positive for what we do as sort of physicians and, you know, healthcare providers to educate ourselves on the platform. I think the other part that we have to remember is that we're really in this business for our patients, right? So can we possibly use social media to affect our patients' arrhythmia management? So to sort of better understand that, we really have to sort of look at the national, international landscape of how social media is used, right? So right now, what we know is that there's about 4 billion users of social media globally, with over 60% or nearly 3 billion monthly active users on Facebook, right here. And then there's also another 30 million or so global users of Twitter, okay? So how does that look in the US? It pretty much parallels it. The highest users are probably still on Facebook, with a smattering of the users on other social media platforms as well. And what's really interesting though is that it's not just all the young people that are using the social media platforms. The fastest growing probably is the age group between 50 and 64. They make up about 69% of users of social media. And then actually 65 and plus make up about 40%. So it's not a small population. So it's pretty interesting. So what do we really feel that we can use social media to help with health management? I think that we could, because the patients are already there and already using it, right? So 80% of internet users are specifically on there to look for health information, and 74% of internet users are on social media, right? And then what's interesting is 43% of those patients are greater than 55 years old, are using social media for health information, and then 61% trust the information that's posted on social media by their clinicians. That's a little scary, right? So they're actually there and watching us. The other thing is that 91% of people who are on social media say that online communities play a role in their healthcare decisions. So these are forums, etc. So is there precedent for really using social media in disease management? The answer is probably yes. I mean, when you look at these studies, there's, from diabetes and smoking cessation to sort of pediatric and adolescent care, and even the cancer care community, who have really been the leaders in this space. There have been many studies that actually have shown that using social media makes health information more accessible, it engages patients, it really provides valuable peer, social, and emotional support, and it might even aid in behavior change and be a nice platform for mass health communication. So what about social media and arrhythmia management? Well, there's some studies currently that sort of cardiology is sort of tiptoeing into the space a little bit in the realm of heart failure and cardiovascular disease, as well as in emergency cardiovascular care. But what's interesting is that for arrhythmia care, there really haven't been many studies at all looking at the use of social media and arrhythmia management. But again, arrhythmia patients are already there. So it's not just any patients, the arrhythmia patients are already there. And how are they there? They're already there and have been there for multiple years in sort of private and public patient forum and groups on Facebook and Reddit and various websites, where they go and they sort of share their experiences and offer each other sort of advice and support. And you can see from this example, these are pulled directly from Facebook. This little thread talks about, has a patient asking about cardioversion and sort of asking what are people's experiences post cardioversion, how do you recuperate? And this patient's asking, hey, I'm gonna be on amiodarone, what are your guys' experiences on amiodarone? The other website that I've seen patients post on also is this myafibexperience.org forum. That's an AHA website that's sponsored also by stopafib.org. And this is, again, another patient forum that they can go and post their experiences and ask questions. So on this example, you can see that a patient asks about actually naturopathic treatment of their atrial fibrillation. And what's nice is when you read through these comments, the patients are really informed and they say, hey, look, it's a nice idea, but probably you should be talking to an electrophysiologist instead. So arrhythmia patients have already integrated social media as a digital health tool, and they really have done this to sort of gain insight and education to their own disease process and really to help sort of empower themselves in their own healthcare and try to improve their own health outcomes. So they are already there. Now, the other part of this is that health information, quote unquote, is also already there, right? And so there's an abundance of health related content that's online, and a lot of it is probably less well studied, and it could be ineffective and even possibly dangerous, right? As you can see from these examples, like using basil leaves for atrial fibrillation and various concoctions here in homeopathy that supposedly 100% cures arrhythmias and palpitations, right? So I think, perhaps we as clinicians should maybe be meeting our patients where they already are. And we should really strongly consider, entering the social media space, not just for our own education, but maybe becoming, being in the social media space to become a little bit more patient facing, and maybe to help guide our patients a little bit more towards more accurate information about arrhythmias that's sort of backed by science. And maybe even, doing as these physicians have done, which is create content that is patient-facing, that's trustworthy, as some people have already started to do. Why else should physicians be in this space? Because, I really feel that it is probably patient and public responsibility of ours to do that. There have been several papers that have been written recently, even including one that was simultaneously published, I think, in 20 journals by 20 or so editors-in-chief writing this manuscript together to sort of talk about how the absence of expert opinion sort of creates this vacuum that ends up being filled by false information that ends up getting perpetuated, as we know from experiences with vaccine misinformation, right? And the tagline from this specific manuscript, which I encourage you to read, is that they really feel that one of the key mission statements of the NHLBI is really to communicate research advances to the public, just like what Mayo Clinic had said, is to not sort of trap this information in the ivory towers, but really translate this science to the public so that they understand it as well. Okay. Now, this sort of provides a nice segue into how else we could possibly use social media, because again, social media, or the goal of sort of arrhythmia management is also, you know, to encompass research, right? To sort of, again, further our own understanding of arrhythmia mechanisms and how arrhythmias respond to treatment, and as well as to sort of continually advance therapeutics for our cardiac arrhythmia patients, right? So we know from several studies that have been published now that social media has become a nice avenue for research dissemination, and it's become actually an important tool for research dissemination because, again, social media has a much larger potential reach than the physical print subscription. So in this specific example, you can see that after 1 year of publication of this specific article, which was not an arrhythmia article, but a different medical subspecialty, they had about 2 citations, right? Then they sort of implemented this social media strategy that was done for about 1 week, and then they measured that after about 1 year, and they found that after 1 year, their citations grew pretty immediately as well. We've also found that there have been some correlations probably with social media dissemination of research and possibly even impact factor. So we know that it also increases your Altmetrics scores, right? So what is your Altmetrics score? We sort of toss this term around sort of willy-nilly a little bit without sort of really truly understanding, but we always see that sort of very colorful donut on all the manuscripts that get published. We know that the currency of academia really is impact factor, right? So everyone's obsessed with impact factor. So whenever you write a paper, we're always thinking, what is the highest impact factor manuscript that, or journal that we can get our manuscript published in? And the impact factor is really calculated based on citations, okay? Altmetrics, it takes into account a little bit more sort of real-time quantification of dissemination, and that includes not just citations, but it includes other things like news media and blogs and podcasts and social media and public policy documents, and it really reflects more sort of real-time quantification and a more nuanced story of your research value than just citations alone. So I think there was this fear at the beginning that Altmetrics would take over conventional metrics, which I think would be absolutely silly. I think really Altmetrics complements conventional metrics, right? Because conventional metrics, again, really just looks at citations and sort of scientific dissemination within the science community, whereas Altmetrics takes that and sort of complements it by looking at how research is looked at outside of sort of the ivory tower. And so I think it's a better estimate of impact and significance of research, and maybe it might even help accelerate translation of research into clinical care. So again, this is the Altmetric donut, and I don't think anyone really has sort of looked at it in detail. What is the Altmetric donut? But just to be short about it, it basically takes into account all of these things. Blogs, Twitter, news, Google, LinkedIn, Reddit, YouTube, all these things make up a different color in the donut, and they're all weighted a little bit differently. And then you come up with an Altmetric score, and obviously higher is better. And so you'd have to really go onto the Altmetrics website to really look at how they calculate that score. But again, it is weighted, right? So something on Facebook is not quite as valuable, obviously, as something on Wikipedia, and not as valuable as something that hits like the major news media, as you can see here. So that was a little bit of a little foray into Altmetrics and research dissemination. What about research recruitment? So what's interesting is that, you know, we're not just disseminating our research findings and publications, but we're finding that social media is yet another avenue for maybe even research recruitment, because we know that, again, there are a multitude of patients on social media that we found that maybe it'd be a good tool to use to actually conduct research and actually specifically to help recruit and enroll patients into research studies. And so not only has it been used by individual researchers, as you can see here, but academic institutions are starting to use this, and it's not just any academic institution, but big academic institutions. Governmental agencies are starting to use it. So the VA, I didn't realize that the VA was already doing it. The VA is using social media to to actively recruit patients, as well as the FDA, as well as the NIH actually has their own Twitter account to try to get people to be recruited into their All of Us research study. On top of that, study sponsors are getting into the game as well. So with the Heartline study, I was able to find this on, actually, I think it was Facebook, that they actually have this study on Facebook so that people can learn about their study and actually enroll virtually. So can we, however, think even bigger, right? So we talked a little bit about research, about patients on the forums, we talked a little bit about research recruitment, and then we talked about governmental institutions recruiting, and then, but can we even think even bigger when it comes to social media and health management? This is a nice graph that illustrates sort of the development in digital public health surveillance over time. And so what they found is that in the recent years, internet-based research tools, including social media, have created this sort of exciting prospects for expanding possible disease surveillance with the hopes of sort of capturing real-time data and sort of more trends for health outcomes. Go to the next slide. And why is that? That's because we know that there is an astounding number of tweets that go out per second, 9,000 tweets per second, more than 700 million tweets per day, and over 250 billion tweets per year. And what are those? Those are data points, right? So just because of that sheer sort of volume, variety, and velocity, social media is actually big data. So there's a bajillion, literally a bajillion data points coming out of Twitter every single day. So when you think about social media and big data and sort of include in that then artificial intelligence and machine learning, then the prospects become even more exciting. So the infectious disease people have totally beat us to the punch on this one for sure. They wrote this really nice paper, I think this is in 2016, yep, that looked at how we derive this sort of big data and how we would do research with it. And what they found was that, you know, using these sort of traditional lab-based data surveillance methods kind of, you know, is delayed and is really based on sort of availability of data by clinical diagnosis. But if you were able to make sort of hybrid systems and use hybrid systems with more sort of progressive data sources like Twitter and search queries and, you know, stuff like crowdsourcing, that maybe we would be able to have a higher and more sort of timelier return of both information, you know, and data volume. So hybrid systems may be the way to go. And how have they done this? So already they've capitalized on this, right? So they've used social media and things like deep neural networks and natural language processing and support vector machine. And they've been able to sort of surveil contagious disease outbreaks. And they've been able to sort of look at how the public sort of responds to disease with really relative accuracy. And so you can see here, they were able to look at a foodborne illness and track it in Chicago. They looked at chikungunya in Europe and how that spread by looking at Twitter as well. And then I thought that these were very interesting. Looking at sort of disease diffusion, they were able to sort of predict how disease diffused by looking at Twitter. And then on this one, they looked at public response to disease, finding that the number of people who got vaccinated and posted on social media tracked almost exactly with the number of vaccines that were reported by the CDC, almost to the day. So that was pretty impressive. So have we done this in cardiovascular disease management? We're starting to with cardiology. There's some entry into big data and AI and machine learning. So with this sort of preliminary study, they looked at about 500,000 tweets with cardiovascular disease and looked at sort of tweet volume and content and found that perhaps it'd be a good way to evaluate the way that the public communicates about cardiovascular disease. And this was done several years ago. But now more recently, I think this study was published within the past several years using, in 2015, 148 million tweets and adding in machine learning, and then repeating that study with 951 million tweets with, again, machine learning and prediction models. They were able actually to predict cardiovascular disease mortality with relative accuracy as well. So things are happening at least with social media, big data, and cardiovascular disease management. Now, has it happened with arrhythmia management? Not quite yet. We've gotten really kind of very good at using, big data sets from, administrative data sets and clinical data sets like Get With The Guidelines. We're very familiar, all of us, with the Apple Heart study and the big data set that went on with that, and also with the Heartline study that's currently going on using data from wearables and biometric data and patient-reported data. And then, we also have done a multitude of studies using very large volume biomarker data with genomics as well. We're also making our first sort of forays into using machine learning and deep learning as far as predicting atrial fibrillation and even with EKG diagnosis of arrhythmias. But really, we haven't really stepped into the use of or the incorporation of using social media, big data into the sort of into the area of improving arrhythmia care quite yet. But it may end up being that this could be another avenue that might help us predict risk in our arrhythmia patients, might even be a new channel to, again, look at drug and device surveillance, similar to what I had shown you previously. Here's another example of, again, like a lead failure that happened, and if there was sort of data listening or social listening that happened within this space, you wonder if you would pick up more device or disease, device or drug surveillance issues. And it may even sort of impact quality of care for our arrhythmia patients as well. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the perils and pitfalls of using this space. So we talked a lot already about sort of, again, how to incorporate social media into your sort of daily life for education. We talked about how it could help your patients. And we took, again, another sort of step back, 30,000-foot view of what could happen in the future with big data. I think the biggest thing for us to sort of remember in all of this is not all that glitters is gold, right? So definitely there's perils and pitfalls in social media. The first one that everybody knows about is that they call it toxic Twitter, right? Or online harassment. This is apparent. I think we probably have all seen it. Especially in sort of the current sort of political and social climate in the past several years. In this survey from the Pew Research Center and Amnesty International, they've done both surveys on online harassment, and they found that almost 2/3 of people consider it a major problem. Over half or almost half of people have experienced personally online harassment. And while men tend to surprisingly experience any form of online harassment more than women do, women are twice as likely as men to say that they've been targeted as a result specifically of their gender. And you can see in the top graph, this is a global survey from Amnesty International. In the US, the numbers are actually higher for harassment of women online. So what about cancel culture? So this kind of comes along with that online harassment, right? So you feel like this cancel culture is sort of rampant, that you hear about in sort of, famous people, celebrities, etc. But medical Twitter is actually not immune to cancel culture, sadly. Even within the last year, I've seen several women really just harassed to the point where they actually have left their social media accounts. This specific person was a surgical resident who actually I think had a couple of accounts, like probably one on Instagram and one on Twitter, and she just was brutalized and she left. She just it was horrible for her. And then this cardiologist also has been harassed relentlessly as well, being questioned by people who basically don't back science. Unfortunately, so it's in medicine, it's within cardiology, but sadly, it's also in electrophysiology, unfortunately. So I'm sure everyone knows John Mandrola. He's an awesome guy. I know him personally. But again, there was this huge pile-on not too long ago on him, and just people sort of just being harassing. To the point where, even more recently, and I'm not going to name names, but even a couple of pretty famous electrophysiologists have actually left Twitter because of horrible online harassment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the do's and don'ts of this space, but just remember, again, all the glitters is not gold. We are not immune by any means to online harassment, and EP specifically has been touched by this. Now, the other thing to be sort of careful with that sort of segues into this is remembering, again, our patients are there. And I keep saying our patients there, our patients there, our patients are there. They're there to educate themselves, obviously, but they're there listening and reading and watching everything that we do in this space, right? So this was a really nice post by this physician who basically said, hey, look, you know, I know you're excited about the things that you do, your very first case or your very cool case, but remember that behind that cool case is a patient, a real life person, right? And so people sort of sometimes say, oh, yeah, whatever, but they're there. And these are actual patients who have written online and said, you know, I don't know, I feel kind of horrible when I see my own scans up there, and maybe I'm not sure that all the physicians are asking before, you know, they're posting these cases online. And they use words like, I feel absolutely awful, or I find this horrifying and I find it bothersome, right? So again, behind every case that we post, again, is a patient. We always have to remember that. The flip side, which is what is interesting though, is there are a large proportion of patients also that are like, hey, look, if you completely de-identified, I don't care, because look, I feel it's not only anonymized, but I feel that it can maybe teach other physicians and healthcare practitioners, but also it might save another person's life. So there's, you know, obviously flip sides to everything, but again, just be very, very careful. And so I'm just going to show you some examples of what not to do. Always be aware of your HIPAA violations, right? We always talk about HIPAA, but sometimes people are not always aware what constitutes a HIPAA violation, because we think HIPAA violation is like putting the patient's name or social or phone number or address or date of birth. It's not just that. If you put anything on that, you know, post of yours that can be traced back to the patient, that is a HIPAA violation. So this is an example of a house staff who did this in the height of the crazy "this is my lane" stuff, when there was a lot of stuff about gun rights and how physicians and trauma physicians specifically were, you know, trying to save lives. And I think in the heat of the moment, he got, you know, caught up in it a little bit and wrote this 16-year-old gunshot wound to the aorta. His mother is in the waiting room, right? Sorry about that. And wrote this, you know, very specific post. And he got pretty much reprimanded harshly for this. And I'm not sure if he even got let go. I never saw him again, I can tell you that. There are, again, specific examples in electrophysiology that this has also happened. So I find this super concerning. Again, never, this one is a 90-year-old lady. So again, age, diagnosis, specific time, 20 days ago, right? And it actually says right now. Another one is, I'll pop up my next slide here. This one, a lot of people are unaware that even though it seems de-identified, right? They're just talking about special incision skills. Any tattoo on any patient that can be identified back to that patient. This patient could see their tattoo and say, hey, that's me. The last one I have here is, and this seems very benign, again, super excited about, you know, having a couple of cases happen with left lateral pathways. But again, it says 2 cases today specifically of left lateral pathways, and then brings in their fellow. So I find that pretty concerning to actually do that. So let me go to the next slide. Sorry, laser pointer. So not only should we be careful of what we post, we should also be careful of maybe what our reps might be posting as well. Just make sure you talk to all your staff members about what they may or may not be posting, because again, these are, you know, true to life examples that I just pulled off of Twitter, and again, using very sort of specific language and bringing in, you know, other people into this tweet that may or may not know that they've been tagged. So just be, again, very aware of what gets posted. And I always put this slide up of, you know, protected health information. Again, it's names, dates, addresses, the stuff that we're really used to. But again, they also say facial images, but really it's any unique identifier. I think this is the main one that I'd be worried about, is any unique identifier that could be traced back to the patient. So I'm going to leave you with this last little paper, and then I'm going to have a couple of wrap-up slides. But this is a wrap-up paper that I wanted to leave with you to wrap up, which was just recently published in Circ Arrhythmia and Electrophysiology, that talks about how social media does not reflect scholarly or clinical activity in real life. I think, you know, people are, you know, calling me and asking about this paper quite a bit, because I think people tend to feel like, oh my gosh, this paper is horrible for anyone who's on social media. If you actually read the paper, it's not. It actually is a nice paper that talks about looking at about 300 attending level EP physicians on Twitter, and they compared that to, you know, the number of their followers, compared that to their H index and their clinical volume. And what they found was that while the majority of people on social media, or majority of EPs on social media, had sort of clinical activity that sort of compared with their number of followers, there are a few outliers as well, right? So these are the ones that are the majority. There are a few outliers where their social media quote unquote influence or number of followers was sort of out of proportion to actually their H index, which was relatively low, and their clinical volume, which was relatively low. So their tagline was that, you know, the higher number of followers did not necessarily correlate with higher H indices or with higher clinical volume. In other words, influence did not necessarily correlate with expertise. So, I mean, I thought that it was a good paper because it really is just a reminder to us to always vet for ourselves the information that we find on the interwebs, and that includes social media. So if you ask me, is the juice worth the squeeze on this? I mean, I think that it is worth it to be on social media after being on it for a decade, but I think you have to use this sort of Peter Parker principle, right? Which is, with great power comes great responsibility. It is a great platform and it is a great tool. Remember, it is a tool to help you, just like a swan is a tool. It is not a, you know, a lab diagnosis, it's a tool to help you, right? You have to use that tool properly to help connect, educate, collaborate, and advocate for you and your patients. And again, I think that outweighs the sort of privacy and harassment and cancel culture that happens, because you can sort of try to do stuff to avoid all of that. And so these are the last couple of slides that talk about that. I talk about the rules of engagement. I live by the saying of everything in moderation. So no rabbit holes, right? Social media and interwebs, it's a great wide world of craziness out there. I try to limit my time if I can. Sometimes, like now with the election, it's a little hard, but you can try to limit some of your time in this space. I know one of my friends says only 20 minutes a day. Some people say only in the morning with coffee. Some people say only between cases or only at the end of the day. So try to give yourself a little bit of time to sort of put it away if it's not for you. Other rules of engagement, I think the most important thing is to be really cognizant of your digital footprint, right? The way I think about it is, we're all in the EP lab. We all know how to avoid radiation. It's the same principles, right? Time, distance, and shielding. So never post the same day. And if you're going to do it, post it way away, weeks and months away. Again, distance, right? Let yourself stew and think about it before you post. Don't post sort of in the heat of the moment. Again, and you have to shield, right? Shield, no identifiers of any type that can be traced back to the patient at all. Next thing is, again, don't tweet while you're angry. It's obvious, right? And then I would really tread lightly with sort of controversial issues and political issues and religious issues and those sorts of things, unless that's sort of your brand. I don't advise that to anyone, to be super controversial in this space. It's not worth it. Because again, not only are your patients watching, your employers are watching, and your mom is watching, and all your friends are watching, right? So the last thing is to really abide by your social media policy. Become very, very familiar with what your institution tells you to do and not to do on social media, and really remember why you're using this at all. Again, it's a tool. It's not the end all be all ever. Okay, and the very last slide is this, and probably the easiest thing to remember. This is from Dr. Rao, and he wrote a nice slide about how to have a successful career in early career, and I thought it was a great slide to use in social media too, which is, don't do anything stupid. Know who your patients are, who your audience is, right? Learn something, teach something, be nice, and be humble. And that's it. So thank you for having me.
Oh, that was great. Very nice overview of a complex topic that I think we're all kind of navigating. Those were great tips for the fellows. There is a question here from Anna. Anna, do you want to just unmute and ask it?
for this wonderful presentation. I was wondering, I wanted to pick your brains. How do you navigate social media efficiently, especially mid Twitter, given that there is just so much information? And how do you use it efficiently without getting drowned in too much information?
Yeah, that's always a good question. Again, I think other people have given social media talks have always put up this slide that have these like little birds on, and like there's like the super excited bird that's just starting with Twitter and is just wants to look at everything. And then there's like those of us who've been in it in a decade who sort of have it and put it down and use it whenever we want to use it. I think you just have to sort of set time limits a little bit, and there is a lot of information. And so what I do is I try to just follow a couple of journals. If you're gonna, I specifically entered the space to want to be a science communicator and to learn and to network, okay? And so I tried to follow people who had high yield information in the EP space and limit it to that. So I was not following a ton of people at the beginning. So I only followed people who were teaching really well in this space, like Josh Cooper does a great job and, you know, does all these sort of little teaching slides. So I followed him. So I followed high yield people, and then there's specific hashtags that I would look up and just scroll through and sort of learn, right? Before the EPEEPS hashtag came up, I would follow stuff like FOMED, which is like free online education in medicine. So it's just a matter of picking and choosing a little bit about what you want to look at. And then again, journals, right? You can always tag the journals and then get them to notify you when they have content that's pushed out. Most people don't have their notifications on at the beginning because you can just get overwhelmed. So I don't recommend putting your notifications on until you've maybe been in this space for a long time and know how to sort of navigate that a little bit.